The morning sun cast long shadows across the courtyard of Kensington Palace as Catherine, Princess of Wales, stood at her bedroom window. Her fingers traced the cool glass while she watched the early preparations below. Today was different from any other royal engagement she had undertaken. Today, they would say goodbye to someone who had been more than just a staff member to their family. Margaret Thornberry had served the royal household for 37 years. She had been there when Diana brought baby William home from the hospital. She had quietly supported Charles through his darkest hours after the divorce. She had welcomed Catherine into the family with genuine warmth when many others remained distant and formal. Now, at 72, Margaret was retiring to a small cottage in the Cotswolds, and Catherine knew this departure would leave a hole in their lives that could never be filled. William entered the room quietly, already dressed in his morning suit. He placed a gentle hand on his wife's shoulder, understanding her contemplative mood without needing words. They had discussed this day for weeks, knowing that traditional royal protocol would call for a simple presentation of a retirement gift and perhaps a brief speech in the stateroom. But both William and Catherine felt that Margaret deserved something more personal, something that would truly honor the woman who had been a constant source of stability in their unpredictable world. "She doesn't know about the change in plans, does she?" Catherine asked, turning to face her husband. Her blue eyes held a mixture of excitement and nervous anticipation. William shook his head, a small smile playing at the corners of his mouth. "She thinks we're having the usual formal ceremony at 2 o'clock. She has no idea we've invited everyone who has ever worked alongside her, or that we've arranged for her sister to fly in from Scotland." The decision to break with protocol had not been easy. Royal traditions existed for good reasons, and both William and Catherine understood the importance of maintaining dignity and proper boundaries. But Margaret had earned something special. She had been the one to comfort William during his teenage years, when the weight of his future responsibilities felt overwhelming. She had been the first person to congratulate Catherine privately after their engagement, sharing stories of William as a boy that helped her understand the man she was marrying. Catherine remembered the day she first met Margaret, just weeks after the engagement announcement. The older woman had been arranging flowers in the blue drawing room when Catherine walked in, feeling lost and uncertain about where she belonged in the grand palace. Margaret had looked up from her roses and smiled with such genuine warmth that Catherine immediately felt at ease. "You look like you could use a cup of tea, my dear," Margaret had said, setting down her pruning shears. "And perhaps someone to show you where everything is. This place can feel like a maze when you're new." That simple act of kindness had blossomed into a deep friendship that transcended the traditional boundaries between royalty and staff. Margaret had been there for the births of George, Charlotte, and Louis, helping Catherine navigate the challenges of royal motherhood. She had offered quiet advice during difficult moments and celebrated personal victories with genuine joy. Now, as Catherine prepared for what would be their final official day together, she felt the weight of wanting to get this farewell exactly right. She and William had spent countless hours planning every detail, determined to create a moment that would honor Margaret's service while expressing the deep affection their family felt for her. The plan they had crafted was unprecedented in royal history. Instead of a formal presentation in the stateroom, they would gather in the orangery, surrounded by the flowers Margaret loved so much. Every person who had worked closely with her over the decades would be there, from fellow housekeepers to senior advisors who had known her since their early days in royal service. William's father, King Charles, had initially raised concerns about the departure from protocol, but when William explained Margaret's unique role in their family's life, the king had not only given his blessing but had insisted on attending himself. He, too, had deep respect for the woman who had served his family with such dedication and discretion. Catherine walked to her dressing table and picked up a small blue box. Inside was a delicate silver locket that had belonged to Diana. William had suggested they give it to Margaret, knowing how much the two women had meant to each other. Diana had often spoken of Margaret's kindness and loyalty, and Catherine felt this gesture would create a beautiful connection between past and present. "Do you think she'll be overwhelmed by all of this?" Catherine asked, holding the locket carefully in her palm. William considered the question thoughtfully. "Margaret has never been one to seek attention or grand gestures, but I think she'll understand that this comes from love, not obligation. She's been part of our family's most important moments. She deserves to have us be part of hers." The morning hours passed quickly as final preparations were made. The orangery had been transformed into an intimate gathering space, with round tables covered in cream-colored linens and centerpieces of Margaret's favorite white roses and lavender. Photographs spanning Margaret's decades of service had been carefully displayed, showing her evolution from a young woman starting her first job to the beloved figure she had become. Catherine had personally written the invitation to each guest, explaining the significance of the occasion and requesting their presence for this special farewell. The response had been overwhelming. Colleagues who had moved to other positions, retired staff members, and even some former royal family members had made arrangements to attend. As noon approached, Catherine and William made their way downstairs to greet the arriving guests. The atmosphere in the palace was different from usual formal events. There was an warmth and intimacy that reflected the genuine affection everyone felt for Margaret. Lord Chamberlain Sir Andrew Parker arrived first, followed by Margaret's longtime friend and colleague, Mrs. Elizabeth Davies, who had served as head housekeeper until her retirement 5 years earlier. The two women had maintained a close friendship, and Catherine knew that Mrs. Davies' presence would mean everything to Margaret. "She has no idea what's coming, does she?" Mrs. Davies asked Catherine, with a conspiratorial smile. Margaret always preferred to stay behind the scenes. "She's going to be quite shocked by all this attention." Catherine laughed softly. "That's exactly why she deserves it. She's spent 37 years making everyone else's important moments perfect. Today, we get to make sure her moment is perfect too." As more guests arrived, Catherine felt her excitement building. This was what royal duty should feel like. Using their position and resources to honor someone who had given so much of herself in service to others. She watched William greeting longtime staff members, seeing how naturally he connected with each person, remembering details about their families and careers that showed his genuine care for the people who worked alongside them. The children had begged to be included in the surprise, and Catherine had agreed, knowing how much Margaret adored them. George, Charlotte, and Louis had each created special drawings for her, and Charlotte had insisted on picking flowers from the palace gardens to add to the centerpieces. At 12:30, Catherine received word that Margaret had arrived at the palace, believing she was coming for a routine meeting with the household staff. Catherine's heart began to beat faster, knowing that in just over an hour, they would finally be able to show Margaret how much she truly meant to their family. William appeared at her side, straightening his tie with nervous energy. "Ready for this?" he asked, though Catherine could see in his eyes that he was as emotional about the day as she was. "More than ready," Catherine replied, clutching the small blue box containing Diana's locket. "Margaret has given us so much love over the years. Today, we finally get to give some of it back." The stage was set for an afternoon that would break royal protocol in the most beautiful way possible, creating a moment of pure human connection that would be remembered long after the formal ceremonies were forgotten. As Catherine looked around at all the people who had come to honor Margaret, she felt certain that they were about to create something truly special. A farewell that would be worthy of a woman who had devoted her life to serving others with grace, kindness, and unwavering loyalty. Margaret Thornberry walked through the familiar corridors of Kensington Palace, her sensible black shoes clicking softly against the polished marble floors. She carried herself with the same quiet dignity that had characterized her 37 years of service, though today she felt a bittersweet mixture of anticipation and sadness. In her hand, she clutched the small thank you cards she had written for each member of the household staff, wanting to personally express her gratitude to everyone who had made her decades at the palace so meaningful. She had been told to meet in the yellow drawing room at 2 o'clock for a brief retirement presentation. Margaret expected a formal handshake, perhaps a small gift, and a few polite words from Prince William or Princess Catherine. She had attended similar ceremonies for other retiring staff members over the years and knew the routine well. The thought of being the center of attention made her slightly uncomfortable. She had always preferred to work quietly behind the scenes, ensuring everything ran smoothly without drawing notice to herself. As she approached the yellow drawing room, Margaret was surprised to find it empty. A young staff member appeared almost immediately, looking slightly flustered. "Oh, Mrs. Thornberry," the girl said, her cheeks pink with what seemed like nervous excitement. "There's been a small change of plans. Would you mind following me to the orangery instead? Margaret's eyebrows rose slightly. The orangery was typically used for larger gatherings, not intimate retirement presentations. She wondered if perhaps they were hosting multiple events simultaneously and needed the drawing room for something else. Without question, she followed the young woman through the palace, passing through corridors lined with portraits of monarchs and family members she had served faithfully throughout her career. As they walked, Margaret's mind wandered to her first day at the palace in 1987. She had been just 35 years old, nervous and eager to prove herself worthy of such an prestigious position. She remembered how overwhelming the grandeur had felt initially, how she had worried constantly about making mistakes or overstepping boundaries. But gradually, the palace had become her second home, and the royal family had become more than just employers. The young staff member led her through the East Wing, past the rooms where Margaret had spent countless hours ensuring every detail was perfect for state dinners, family celebrations, and important meetings. She thought of all the moments she had witnessed: the joy of royal births, the solemnity of mourning periods, the excitement of engagements and weddings. She had been privileged to see the human side of people the world only knew from newspaper photographs and television coverage. As they approached the orangery, Margaret could hear voices and what sounded like gentle music playing. Her confusion deepened. Surely a simple retirement presentation wouldn't require such elaborate arrangements. The young woman paused before the ornate doors, turning to Margaret with barely contained excitement. "Mrs. Thornberry," she said, her voice trembling slightly, "Their Royal Highnesses wanted me to tell you how much your service has meant to everyone here. Today is about celebrating you." Before Margaret could respond, the doors were opened, and she found herself looking into a room filled with faces she recognized and loved. Her hand flew to her mouth in shock as she saw colleagues from every era of her service, friends who had retired years ago, and family members she hadn't expected to see. The room erupted in warm applause, and Margaret felt tears spring to her eyes as the magnitude of what was happening began to sink in. At the center of the gathering stood Prince William and Princess Catherine, both smiling with genuine warmth. But it was the presence of her younger sister, Janet, who lived in Scotland and rarely traveled due to her health issues, that completely overwhelmed Margaret. Catherine had somehow arranged for Janet to be brought down for the celebration, understanding how much her family meant to her. "Surprise, Maggie," Janet said, using the childhood nickname that only family members were allowed to use. The sisters embraced while the gathered crowd continued their applause, many wiping away tears of their own as they witnessed Margaret's obvious emotion. Prince William stepped forward, his own eyes bright with unshed tears. "Margaret," he said, his voice carrying across the beautifully decorated room, "when Catherine and I began planning your retirement celebration, we realized that the usual formal presentation felt completely inadequate for someone who has given so much of herself to our family." Margaret struggled to compose herself, overwhelmed by the thought and care that had obviously gone into creating this moment. She looked around the room, recognizing faces from every decade of her service. There was Mrs. Davies, her dearest friend and former colleague, beaming with pride. There was James Mitchell, the head butler who had trained her in royal protocol when she first arrived. There were newer staff members she had mentored, and there were people who had moved on to other positions but had returned specifically to honor her. Princess Catherine approached with a warm smile, taking Margaret's hands gently in her own. "You've been there for every important moment in our lives," Catherine said, her voice soft but carrying clearly through the suddenly quiet room. "We wanted to make sure we could be here for one of yours." The formality that usually characterized royal events was completely absent. Instead, there was an atmosphere of genuine love and appreciation that made the gathering feel more like a family reunion than an official ceremony. Margaret noticed that the decorations reflected her personal tastes rather than standard royal protocol. White roses and lavender, her favorite flowers, adorned every table. The music playing softly in the background was classical pieces she had often hummed while working, somehow remembered and incorporated into the celebration. King Charles appeared at her side, having arrived quietly during the initial commotion. "Margaret," he said warmly, "I remember the day you started here. You were so nervous, but determined to do everything perfectly. I don't think you realize how much stability and kindness you've brought to our family over these decades." Margaret curtsied automatically, but the king gently touched her arm. "Not today," he said with a smile. "Today, you're our honored guest." The afternoon unfolded like a beautiful dream. Instead of a formal presentation, there were heartfelt speeches from colleagues sharing favorite memories of working alongside Margaret. Mrs. Davies told the story of Margaret staying all night to comfort a young staff member whose mother had fallen ill, missing her own sister's wedding to provide support when it was needed most. James Mitchell recounted how Margaret had single-handedly organized a surprise birthday celebration for a security guard whose family lived too far away to visit, ensuring he didn't spend the day alone. Prince George, Princess Charlotte, and Prince Louis appeared with their own special presentations. George had created a detailed drawing of Margaret in the palace gardens, capturing her love of flowers with surprising accuracy for his age. Charlotte presented a carefully pressed flower from every garden on the palace grounds, bound in a handmade book with the title, Margaret's Flowers, written in her careful child's handwriting. Louis, despite his young age, had insisted on learning a short poem to recite, which he delivered with serious concentration, while Margaret listened with tears streaming down her cheeks. But it was Princess Catherine's personal speech that truly captured the essence of what Margaret meant to the family. Standing before the gathered crowd, Catherine spoke without notes, her words coming directly from her heart. "When I first arrived at the palace," Catherine began, "everything felt overwhelming and foreign. I was trying so hard to learn the protocols and expectations that I forgot the most important thing. That this place, despite all its grandeur, is actually a home. Margaret was the person who reminded me of that. She showed me where to find comfort when I felt lost, how to navigate not just the physical spaces but the emotional landscape of royal life." Catherine paused, looking directly at Margaret with obvious affection. "You've been present for every milestone in our family's life. But more than that, you've been present for the quiet moments that no one else sees. You've celebrated with us in private joys and supported us through private struggles. You've helped raise our children with the same love and dedication you've shown in every aspect of your service." The room was completely silent, except for the soft sounds of people crying. Margaret herself was overwhelmed by the realization that her work had been noticed and valued in ways she had never imagined. She had always believed that good service meant remaining invisible, ensuring everything ran smoothly without drawing attention to herself. To discover that her efforts had not only been noticed but had touched the lives of the people she served so deeply was more meaningful than any formal recognition could have been. As the afternoon continued, Margaret found herself surrounded by warmth and love from every direction. Old friends shared stories, new colleagues expressed their admiration, and family members she rarely saw because of her demanding schedule were able to spend unhurried time with her. The gathering felt timeless, as if the usual constraints of royal scheduling had been suspended to allow for something more important than protocol: the celebration of a life well lived in service to others. As the afternoon sun began to cast longer shadows through the glass walls of the orangery, Princess Catherine knew the moment had arrived for the final gesture she and William had planned. Throughout the celebration, she had watched Margaret's face transform from shock to overwhelming joy. Seeing how deeply the older woman was touched by the outpouring of love from everyone who had worked alongside her over the decades, Catherine excused herself quietly from the conversation she was having with Margaret's sister Janet, making her way to where William stood near the main display of photographs chronicling Margaret's 37 years of service. He was studying a particular image from 1987. Margaret's first week at the palace, looking young and nervous but determined as she learned her duties from the head housekeeper of that era. "It's time," Catherine whispered to her husband, placing her hand gently on his arm. She could feel her heart beating faster as she anticipated Margaret's reaction to what they had planned as the culmination of this special day. William nodded, understanding immediately what she meant. They had saved the most personal gesture for last, wanting the celebration to build to this moment when they would present Margaret with something that would truly express how much she meant to their family. Together, they approached the small stage area that had been set up at one end of the orangery. William gently requested everyone's attention, his voice carrying the warmth and sincerity that characterized all his interactions with the palace staff. "Before we conclude this wonderful afternoon," he began, "Catherine and I have one final surprise for Margaret. But first, I want to share something that I think everyone here will understand." The room grew quiet, guests settling into their chairs or moving closer to hear what the prince had to say. Margaret, still overwhelmed by the entire experience, found herself guided to a chair near the front. Her sister Janet beside her for support. "My mother once told me," William continued, his voice growing softer and more reflective, "that the true measure of a person's character isn't found in how they treat those who can do something for them, but in how they treat those who can do nothing for them in return. By that measure, Margaret Thornberry is one of the finest people I have ever known." Catherine watched Margaret's face as William spoke, seeing the older woman's eyes fill with tears once again. Throughout her career, Margaret had touched so many lives through small acts of kindness that she probably thought went unnoticed. She had comforted homesick young staff members, remembered everyone's birthdays, and created a sense of family among people who were far from their own homes. "Margaret," William continued, "you've been there for every important moment in my life since I was 8 years old. You helped me through some of my darkest teenage years, celebrated my achievements, and welcomed Catherine into our family with the same warmth and love you've shown to everyone lucky enough to know you." Catherine stepped forward, holding the small blue velvet box that contained the locket that had belonged to Diana. Her hands trembled slightly as she spoke, knowing the significance of what they were about to give Margaret. "When William and I were planning this celebration," Catherine said, her voice clear but emotional, "we kept thinking about what gift could possibly express our gratitude for everything you've given us. We realized that the most meaningful gifts aren't purchased, they're passed down. Carrying love from one generation to the next." She approached Margaret and gently placed the box in the older woman's hands. "This belonged to Diana," Catherine explained, her voice gentle but audible to everyone in the room. "She spoke often of your kindness and loyalty, and I know she would want you to have something that was special to her." Margaret's hands shook as she opened the box, revealing the delicate silver locket that had been one of Diana's favorite pieces of jewelry. Inside, visible through the partially open heart-shaped pendant, was a tiny photograph of William and Harry as young boys, the same picture Diana had carried close to her heart for years. The silence in the room was profound as everyone present understood the magnitude of this gesture. For Catherine to give Margaret something so personal and precious from Diana's collection was unprecedented, a gesture that transcended the normal boundaries between royal family and staff, to acknowledge the deep love and respect they felt for this remarkable woman. Margaret looked up at Catherine and William through her tears, unable to find words adequate to express how she felt. In that moment, years of proper protocol and formal distance melted away, replaced by pure human emotion and genuine love. "I don't know what to say," Margaret whispered, her voice barely audible but somehow carrying to every corner of the quiet room. "I never expected, I never imagined." Catherine knelt beside Margaret's chair, taking the older woman's hands in hers. "You don't need to say anything," she said softly. "You've already said everything through 37 years of loving service. This is just our way of saying thank you, and telling you that you'll always be part of our family." The formal presentation that palace protocol would have demanded was completely forgotten, replaced by something far more meaningful. A moment of genuine human connection that honored the relationship that had developed between Margaret and the family she had served with such dedication. As Margaret carefully fastened the locket around her neck, King Charles approached with his own words of farewell. "Margaret," he said, his voice carrying the weight of decades of shared experiences, "you've seen our family through some of our most challenging times and some of our greatest joys. Your discretion, loyalty, and kindness have been constants in a world that often feels unpredictable. We are better people for having known you." The gathering gradually began to disperse as the late afternoon light faded, but nobody seemed eager to leave. Conversations continued in small groups, with guests sharing final stories, and Margaret receiving countless hugs and promises to stay in touch. The children presented their artwork and pressed flowers with serious ceremony, making Margaret promise to display them prominently in her new cottage. As the last guests departed, Margaret found herself alone with William, Catherine, and the children in the now quiet orangery. The formality that usually characterized their interactions had completely disappeared, replaced by the comfortable intimacy of a family saying goodbye to someone they truly loved. "Will you really come visit us in the Cotswolds?" Margaret asked, still hardly believing that this day had happened, that the royal family had broken so many protocols just to honor her retirement. "Try and stop us," Catherine replied with a warm smile. "We'll want to see your garden, and the children will need to know where to send their letters." William nodded in agreement. "Margaret, you've been part of our family's story for almost 4 decades. That doesn't end just because you're retiring. We hope you know that you'll always have a place in our lives." As they walked together toward the palace entrance, where a car waited to take Margaret home, she reflected on the extraordinary nature of what had just happened. In a world where royal protocol dictated almost every interaction, William and Catherine had chosen to prioritize love over tradition, creating a farewell that honored not just her years of service but her value as a human being. The locket rested warmly against her chest, a tangible reminder of the love and respect she had earned through decades of quiet dedication. As her car pulled away from Kensington Palace for the last time as an employee, Margaret touched the pendant gently, knowing that she was carrying with her not just a piece of jewelry, but a piece of the family's heart. Behind her, William and Catherine stood watching from the palace steps with their children, knowing that they had succeeded in creating exactly what they had hoped for. A farewell worthy of a woman who had given so much of herself in service to others. The wordless moment as they waved goodbye said everything that formal speeches could never express about love, gratitude, and the bonds that transcend traditional boundaries when people truly care for one another. In the weeks that followed, Margaret would often touch Diana's locket and remember this perfect afternoon, when a royal family had shown her that the greatest privilege of service is not serving royalty, but being loved by the people you serve. And William and Catherine would always remember that sometimes the most important royal duties have nothing to do with protocol and everything to do with recognizing the extraordinary people who make their lives possible.